in which Netanyahu, struggling to find a way to form a government, has brought in and legitimized the most extreme right-wing racist.
Stay with us. Let me bring in now Rashid Khalidi and Martin Indyk. Khalidi is the professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University, and Indyk was the United States' special envoy for Israel-Palestinian negotiations under President Obama. He also served 2 different stints as the U.S. ambassador to Israel under President Clinton. Rashid, let me begin by asking you, what is the root of this and don't go back all the way, decades and decades. What I mean is, this didn't just begin with the rockets and the airstrikes. Explain to us what was happening in terms of what Israel was doing in East Jerusalem, which seems to have triggered all of this.
That is what triggered it. The assault on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, firing stun grenades and tear gas into the mosque while people were worshiping on a Ramadan night, and the attempted evictions, the dispossession, the expulsion of Palestinian refugees who had been settled in East Jerusalem in homes with which Jewish groups claimed, set everything off, as did the heavy-handed policing of the Israelis in the streets of the old city. But those are linked to older issues. I know people don't want to go back, but when people who are refugees from 1948 are being evicted yet again, it strikes a chord with Palestinians everywhere. Everybody in Jordan, in Israel, Palestinians all over the world react to this and understand this. And so each of these actions, the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on Ramadan, on a night of Ramadan when worshippers were actually praying, and other actions in Jerusalem, in each case raised for Palestinians who are frustrated and angry, in any case, because of the kind of oppression that they're subject to in different ways in different parts of old mandatory Palestine. It raised for them all of these old issues and traumas, and things have been bubbling for quite a while, and I think what happened in the Al-Aqsa Mosque was actually the trigger.
Martin, I saw Palestinian activists and observers saying they felt that the reason this was happening was that the Netanyahu government was trying to essentially Judaize Jerusalem, that is, to turn it away from a kind of place, a city that was in many ways a shared space for Palestinians and Israelis, and make it more completely and wholly a Jewish city. Is that fair?
Yeah, I do think it's fair. The process has been going on for a very long time in Jerusalem, but I think it's been given a turbo boost as a result of domestic Israeli politics, in which Netanyahu, struggling to find a way to form a government, has brought in and legitimized the most extreme right-wing racist organizations and their leadership into the mainstream, into the right-wing list and into the Knesset. And that's given a boost to these right-wing extremists who are pushing their agenda at a time when I think the political class was distracted by trying to form a government. And as a consequence of that, you see that in Jerusalem. We've also seen it in the West Bank, where the settler movement has been pushing to try to expand the settlements, building settlement outposts that are illegal under Israeli law, and now trying to legalize them through the Knesset. So the recent period, I'd say, over the last 10 years, has seen a swing in Israel to the right, and that pendulum has still been swinging further to the right, and that has enabled this kind of chauvinistic extremism to gain a greater grip, and that has roiled things with the Palestinians.
Let me quickly just ask you a follow-up, Martin, which is, does that mean that Bibi Netanyahu might be able to use this crisis as a way to stay in power somehow?
It's entirely possible. There have been 4 elections in Israel in 2 years in which Netanyahu and his right-wing religious coalition, notwithstanding what I just said, have been unable to form a stable government. And it looks like, as a result of this outbreak of conflict, that Israel will head back into a fifth election. And we'll have to see whether the conflict will give him a boost because he's been tough and cracking down on the Palestinians, or whether Israelis will turn around and say, you know, you brought us these problems with your indulgence of the chauvinistic extremist right, racist right, and you're to blame for this. It's impossible in the heat of the conflict to tell at this moment how it's going to happen. But, you know, you discuss with Nick this question of the surprising way in which this conflict has spilled over into Israel proper, and the violence between Jewish and Arab mobs within Israel. That comes in the context of Netanyahu actually legitimizing the move of Israeli Arab parties into the mainstream of Israeli politics. And I hope that the Israelis will come to see that that was the right path, that equal rights for Israel's Arab citizens is something positive that should come out of this conflict.
And Rashid, when you look at the Palestinian side, is there also a story here of greater polarization? It seems that Hamas has gained a certain amount of the momentum. Abbas once again postponed elections. I can't remember when the last time he allowed elections in the West Bank was. Explain to us what the dynamic is on the Palestinian side.
2006 was the last election. Yes, there's no question, but that the undermining of the Palestinian Authority by the kind of extremism that has developed increasingly in Israel, and as a result of the malign neglect by American policymakers of every substantial issue in Palestine, refugees, Jerusalem. The United States has not addressed these issues for decades. In fact, it would not allow Palestinian negotiators to address them in negotiations Martin himself was involved in decades ago. The malign neglect by the United States of these issues and the humiliation of the Palestinian Authority, which is weak and lacks a great deal of legitimacy, because, as you've said, the last elections were 15 years ago, 14 years ago. All of these things, I think, contributed. But the spark, again, was Jerusalem. The spark, again, was dispossession of people who had already been dispossessed. If you don't address refugee issues, if you don't address property issues, if you don't address control of the holy places in Jerusalem, if you support normalization deals with Arab countries while ignoring all of these issues, sooner or later you're putting tinder in place that's going to lead to a conflagration. And of course, Hamas exploited that. There's no question of that. As it exploited the increasing extremism of Israelis encouraged by this government, this Israeli government, over the last 10 years, which has not just led to settlers burning Palestinian olive groves in the West Bank or attacking Palestinians, has not just led to these marches calling for death to the Arabs through the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem, is leading to some of these extremists coming from the West Bank to cities like Haifa, like Lid, like Akka, like Jaffa, and essentially provoking the Arab residents by trying to establish in Arab neighborhoods a Jewish presence. Something that's been happening, by the way, in Jerusalem and the West Bank literally for 53 years. So I think that you can talk about the internal divisions amongst the Palestinians, which are a terrible problem for the Palestinians. But I think you have to talk about both the role of the United States, which I think has actually seriously exacerbated this conflict through everything that's been done by administration after administration, and of course the things that are going on inside Israel are a major contributor. I mean, who sends the police into the third holiest mosque in Islam to fire stun grenades and tear gas? We saw the images. CNN carried them at worshipers on one of the holiest nights of Ramadan. I mean, who does that? And what kind of government orders that kind of thing? And with what kind of domestic shenanigans as the motivation? The desperation of Netanyahu to get people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich into his government led him to curry favor with literally the most extreme, most racist elements in Israeli society. Some of them were stirring up trouble in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood where people were about to be evicted. Some of them led these marches through the Arab quarters, neighborhoods of the old city of Jerusalem, smashing down people's doors, calling for death to Arabs. These are people being courted by the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister of Israel and I would argue the United States government, because of its malign neglect of the core issues, not putting a Band-Aid on this, not just getting a ceasefire, dealing with these issues over, I would argue, multiple administrations, is where you get the situation that you have. In addition, of course, I would argue, I agree with you, Palestinian division is an enormous problem. But it's a problem for the Palestinians, and it's a problem that's exacerbated by external support for different factions, not just by Iran. Everybody talks about Iran and Hamas, by the United States, by Israel, by different Arab countries, by Turkey. This is a Palestinian problem the Palestinians have to solve, but the meddling by outside actors has muddied the waters, and it kept the Palestinians divided, which is a strategic objective, of course, of Israel.
Martin, Rashid brings up the United States. The Trump administration's Abraham Accords initiative, and really its entire policy, was premised on the idea the Palestinian issue was not that important. The Arabs really cared more about an anti-Iranian alliance, an anti-Shia alliance in a sense. Does this demonstrate that that was all wrong, or will we see that at the end of the day the Saudis, the UAE, Egypt will not do much to help the Palestinians?
Well, I think that is true and has been true for a very long time. But what the Trump administration did was not just to promote normalization between Israel and the Arabs. That was, in fact, something that the United Arab Emirates brought up. It wasn't their agenda. Their agenda was, if you remember, Fareed, the deal of the century. It was actually an Israeli-Palestinian deal. And it contributed to the tensions that have exploded now, because it took these core issues, some of which Rashid has been referring to, and that are part of the negotiation of a final agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. And it came in and sided with Israel on every one of these issues. So there was nothing in it for the Palestinians. And that, unfortunately, undermined America's role as an honest broker, as a mediator in these negotiations. In fact, the Palestinians wouldn't talk to the Trump administration for something like 3 years after they moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. So I think that the normalization process, while a good thing in itself, did nothing to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And Martin, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're out of time.